Good morning, everybody. Again, my name is Tim Osborne, and we're going to talk about the risk-based approach in your laboratories, and we're going to look at it from assessor's perspective and things like that. But the key here is surviving the assessment, but also looking at how do you survive your internal audits as well. So when we talk about assessors, we'll talk about internal auditors as we go through this. So, Ferraris. Anybody like Ferraris? Anybody know what this is? It's a what?
A car.
A car, exactly. So this is a 1965. It's a good year because that was the year I was born. Now you know how old I am. But anyways, my father had this Ferrari. It's a 330 GT 2+2. And it's a V12 and it does well over 180 miles an hour. And we'll tell you a little bit more about this Ferrari in a few minutes. So, driver's licenses. I think you're going to start to see a pattern here. The first driver's license, how difficult was it? Extremely, right? You're all nervous and things like that. You actually win it, don't you? Because you go out there and you strive and you finally pass your driver's test. Can you imagine having multiple driver's licenses? I've had driver's licenses in 4 states: Maryland, South Carolina, Michigan, and California. What you don't know is that I had multiple licenses in those states. And the reason being is because I like to go fast, right? Or at least I used to back when I was in the Navy. For those of you who know me, I was in the Navy and submarines for 6 years. So whenever I got a chance to get out of the boat, off the boat, that's what we call it, I would like to go fast. And unfortunately, when you get enough speeding tickets, or as my wife calls them, safe driver awards, you get your licenses pulled. So I've had, in the course of my life, 8 licenses. So that's nothing to be proud of, but what it is what I'm trying to illustrate here is risk. And it's the effect, so as we saw yesterday, and we saw in our, and Tim presented it yesterday, and CJ presented it. If you haven't attended that session, it's a really good session. I would ask you to attend it this afternoon. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And my objective was to get somewhere on time or ahead of time. My dad brought me up and said, you either be there, if you're there on time, you're late, and if you're there 15 minutes, you're on early, you're on time. So with every uncertainty, there are 2 components, right? There's a positive side and a negative side to measurement uncertainty, or any kind of uncertainty. The positive side is, this is a picture of my father's 75th birthday party that we just had. And this is probably about 80% of the family. But my goal is to make sure I get where I need to on time, my objective. The downside, or the negative side of the uncertainty, is the Safe Driver Award that I was just talking about. And I can't tell you, I don't have enough fingers and toes to tell you how many tickets I have. But fortunately, I got smarter, and I only get maybe 1 ticket a year. Okay? So I don't have any points, knock on wood. Right? But there are ways we can manage uncertainty, and today we're going to be focusing on how we manage uncertainty. And Waze was a fantastic thing for me. Because in some places like Virginia, where they don't allow speed detectors, they can't outlaw Waze. But they're talking about it, right? They're talking about taking the police off of that. But actually, I'm a much safer driver these days. But Waze is a really good tool to help manage it. So the balance of today's talk is going to be focusing on how we manage the risk. So we're going to focus in 4 areas today. Excuse me. We're going to look at what assessors are looking for, and how many of you are auditors, internal auditors? There are a ton of people that are QA people, okay? So for those of you who are, and there are some of you that are auditors and assessors, so when I'm talking about assessors, I'm also speaking to internal auditors as well, because you serve as educators. The second area we're going to focus on is how ISO addresses risk in various standards in the various parts of the industry, in manufacturing, in forensics inspections, 17020 we'll talk a little bit about. And we'll talk about laboratories and in 17025. Third, we'll talk about how do you integrate risk-based thinking into your internal audits. And a lot of people don't look at internal audits as risk-based thinking, but it really is. And we'll talk about the various components of internal auditing that focus on risk and how you manage that appropriately. And last, we'll talk about how you incorporate workflows. It's a little bit of a spoiler for those of you who didn't attend yesterday's session that CJ and Tim hosted. We'll talk about their workflow that they have, no best-in-class workflow, very briefly, and then we'll finish up for the rest of the morning. With that, let's get started. So as an assessor, one of the things that I teach when I teach assessors at A2LA and around the world is that you have to take the risk bias that you bring to the table, and that includes internal auditors, and you have to put it in your back pocket, okay? You have to take your lenses off and look at the objective lenses that you're of the people that you're auditing. Your focus is on identifying and helping the people that you're auditing, your auditees, identify what those risks are and how do they analyze it. And when they analyze it, how do they evaluate it? And then what do they do to treat it? And so it's your job to understand what the culture is of that area that you're auditing. And for those of you that are in conglomerate laboratories and things like that, where you have more than one, every laboratory is its own culture. And guess what? Every process, every subgroup within your company has its own culture associated with it, different personalities. So as an assessor and an auditor, it's your job to understand that and not to project what you think their risks are onto them. So there are some core things that we need to talk about when being an assessor or being an auditor. When you, excuse me, I took a Claritin this morning, so I apologize for the coughing. The core, so the first thing you have to do in your prior document review, whether you're an auditor or an assessor, is make sure you understand what the context of the audit that you're doing. And what that means is, do you understand who it is that this customer is servicing, what their requirements are, and even the internal stakeholders, what their requirements are. That's the purpose of a prior document review, is so that you can understand the culture that you're going to audit. The next thing you do is look at their objectives. And how do you look for objectives in a company? Well, you look at their management review. If you look in 17025, you have up to O letters worth of objectives that you can take a look at. All right, so you're taking a look and seeing what are the pain points, what are the things that the laboratory is discussing or the particular area that you're auditing are focused on. And we'll talk about those different areas in a slide or two from now. Once you've identified the objectives, you know what the risks of the laboratory are. You know where they're investing their time in, where they're making improvements, where they're making corrections. And when you do that, your job is to carry that forward into your opening interview and understand and couple that with understanding how they evaluate it. So, like I said earlier, as an assessor or an auditor, you are a mentor. And one of the things I really liked about Jeff, and I liked about the TEA, the evil assessor picture up there, and I didn't get a chance to slide that into my deck here, but when you go in, how you present yourself really will drive the success of your audit and your assessment, your attitude. And if you go in with the attitude of, I'm going on a witch hunt, you won't be successful. And what you do is you put people back on their heels and you won't get the information you need, and you won't be able to evaluate their risks and understand what their risks are and get the information you need to understand whether or not they know what these risks are and how they manage them. So when you are in your opening meeting, here's what I suggest to most of the assessors when I meet up with them is go back through these core principles. Have a teaching moment with them so that they understand this risk concept is a new concept in the standard, but it's not new to any one of us. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Help them to understand what the context is. Who is their customer? Why are they doing what it is that they're doing? And then when they understand that, then they go, oh yes, now I understand what our objectives now. Now I understand why we have a turnaround time. Now I understand why we have to have a 95% success rate when we're doing reviews of our reports and all of these other things. And you serve this Q&A that you have in your opening meeting serves as a catalyst to get them to think about these important areas that they think about, but they never associate with risk. So your job is association for them. When they discover their risks, then when you're asking and you're out on the floor talking to them and asking them, what is the risk in this particular area? They're quick to answer and say, well, what do you do to manage that? Oh, we do this, we do that. And the standard is replete with all kinds of ways that you've been managing risk. And you'll discover, if you read the standard closely, we've been managing risk since the days that quality management standards have been created, because that's what they're for, right? So there's really nothing new about risk management in risk management other than that we added a nasty 4-letter word to it, okay? So during the assessment, it's your job to make sure when you're evaluating risk, you ask the appropriate questions. And the technique that you ask them is extremely important. For those of you that are taking notes, I will have this PDF presentation available to you afterwards. Do they recognize risks? And a lot of times they don't, and they don't understand what that means. And you have to illustrate that. So come to them when you're setting up and you're planning your audits, your assessments, and you know with whom you're going to be speaking. Set up gimme questions. And what I call those gimme questions are ones that they can hit and be successful at right out of the gate. All right? So winning over it like Scott did, introducing me, saying I've got 5 kids and I like to jump on the trampoline, right? Those are icebreakers. Bringing those questions in that they know that they can be successful at and associating with them will help you to be successful and the laboratories to be successful with and when they implement the risk management plan. So how do they identify them? Talk to management. Has management had conversations with them on how to identify risks? Do they even call it risks? A lot of times when I talk and consult with laboratories, the risk is that nasty 4-letter word. They don't know what it is, they don't know how to implement it, so you have to coach. So demonstrate for them how they identify risks. When you talk about metrics and objectives, let me ask you this. Anybody know what an objective is? I brought the word up twice already. What's an objective? Anyone?
Goal, desired end state.
Goal, a desired end state? Okay. Objectives are set to meet a goal. For example, if I want to lose weight, my goal is to lose weight. Now, the objective is what strategies am I going to employ to get there, and then within those strategies, what objectives do I meet to meet my goal? An objective is SMART, right? Objectives. Most people say goals are smart. It's actually the objectives that are smart. How many of you know what a measurand is? 1. Uh-oh. Okay, so let me define a measurand. It's one of those nasty metrology words. Get the metrologist off the stage, right? So a measurand is something specific that you measure. It's a quantity that you measure. In metrology, we call it a measurand, and it's nothing more than a management objective. That's what a management measurand is, an objective. So for example, if I'm measuring a 1 kilogram mass, and most of you probably know what a 1 kilogram mass is, and I put it on a scale here. Well, let me put it on at Hilton Head. It's a little higher in elevation here. But then when I weigh it here, you're going to discover that the weight is going to be a little bit different. So what an objective or a measurand does is it defines specific conditions under which a goal is going to be met. And so all objectives are those specific conditions. And you have them in your laboratory. Turnaround time, right? Everybody talks around turnaround time. In my last job, when I was a technical director and the president came up to me and said, Tim, we have a 5-day turnaround time on our equipment that we service our customers. And we're at 13.4 days. And I'm like, okay. He says, what are you going to do about it? I said, think about the measurand concept here for a second. And I said, well, what happens if we take repairs out of that? Well, yeah, we should be taking repairs out of that because it takes normally 2 to 3 weeks. Okay, well, if we take repairs out, I'm down to 7.4 days. I'm still not meeting my target. What if I need to make adjustments? Well, then that ends up bringing me down to about 4.8 days at 90%. Okay? So when you're defining objectives, they have to be specific. They have to be measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. That's what SMART means. And so as you're going through these, you're taking the similar illustration that I'm sharing with you, and you're giving it to them and helping them to build on it so they go, oh, yeah, we have that all the time. We have our feedback rate is 95% at 4.5, and all of a sudden people start spitting out all of these really cool objectives that the laboratory has. And every department and every process has its own objectives. And why do you set objectives? Because you're managing risk. That's what objectives are for. The reason I want to lose weight is so I don't have a stroke when I'm, 65 years old. Right? I want to be healthy. That's why I jump on a trampoline and risk without the walls on them, right? Because I'm crazy that way. But anyway, when you've identified that and you've educated them a little bit, all of a sudden, now you can ask all these questions that we have on the screen. What are your risks? Associating them with the objectives. Why do you want to manage them? Why do we want to manage risks? And we've got a majority of people here in the forensics business, right? Why do you want to manage risk? You don't want to incarcerate somebody incorrectly, right? You don't want to, well, I've got a golf game I want to go to at Friday, so I'm going to push these results through very quickly, right? So that I can get out and do my job. And then what ends up happening is, if you're doing DNA testing, which takes a little bit of time, you end up incarcerating a lot of people incorrectly, right? How do you give somebody's life back, right? It's very difficult to do that. So when you ask the individual, ask the company how they do that. Talk to management. When you're talking with them, does that risk that the management have, does that flow down? Are the objectives that customer service, the people in receiving, the people actually performing the test measurement, whatever they're doing, or the inspection, is it actually making it down to them, and are those reports going all the way back up? All those reports that you do in the different levels of management review is a risk management tool. Show them that and help them to understand it and the importance. Why? The key is customer confidence, right? That's the bottom line. I want a job at the end of the day. I don't have enough money to drive that Ferrari that we have up there, right? That's my dad's, but we all have things that we want to do, but if we don't have a job to do that because we're not meeting our customers' needs, then that puts us at risk. All right, so risk in business, risky business. I had to put Tom Cruise up there because that's my age, right? So anyway, there are all kinds of areas that you can look at risk, okay? There are characters. We got all these characters up here. I guarantee you have all those characters in your business. Right? You have negative Nancy, and you have the evil assessor, and you have the congratulations to corrective action man, okay? We have all these different things that focus in there and demand our very attention that management is focused on. How does management push these goals and these objectives down to the least common denominator? And I hate using that word because the people that are actually doing the work are the greatest common factor in all of that we do. So, now we're moving into during the assessment. There are areas that you can look at in all of the standards that we're going to look at. ISO 9001 2015, 17020 2012, and 17025 2017. Whenever you look in these standards, even before the last 5 or 10 years, if you were to go back to the beginning of the 20th century when the British were the first ones to document a management system, they're all risk management standards. Why do they put it in there? Because of mission. The reason the first one came out was due to military. They wanted to make sure that when they were shooting cannonballs from one ship to the next, that all the cannonballs actually fit the muzzle of the cannon, right? That's a problem if 10% are the only ones that actually make it through. You end up losing the war, okay? So when you look in the standards, if any place that requires a document, okay? And we call that documented information. Documented information can be procedures, could be policies, processes, programs, plans, they can be forms. All of this stuff are used to mitigate your risks. In 17025, there are explicit statements that talk about risk. Okay? 710.3, it talks about non-conforming work and how you have to manage risks in that particular area. You have to apply actions that actually mitigate risk to the appropriate level. What you don't want to do is encapsulate your organization in concrete, because that will minimize the errors that you're going to produce. That doesn't make any sense. So what are the costs versus the benefits of applying a particular action? The other way that you see risks being managed are what kind of records do the standards require you to do? And what are the details of those records? Now, as an organization, you can choose to expound or expand upon the requirements of the standard because of the risks that you've identified in your laboratory. And the risks that you identified are typically resource-driven, okay? Typically people. How well are you training your people? How competent are they in making the measurements? Did you hire the right group? Jeff Smith did a wonderful job yesterday talking about engagement. How engaged are your people? There are a lot of intangibles in 17025 that are risk management tools, okay? There are explicit records in 17025 and the other ones. In every single one of them, albeit in 9001-2015, talks about impartiality. Impartiality, especially in the forensics business and especially in the medical and the safety businesses. Every place where risk to the individual, the life and the well-being of an individual, impartiality is extremely important, and you'll see that prominent in those standards. Decision rules, making statements of conformance. Is it in, is it out, is it questionable? And how you manage reporting that back to your customers. Are those decision rules embedded in the processes and the methods that you're using, or do you have to have that critical discussion with your customer? Are they willing to accept a probability of false accept or a false reject? And management review is the penultimate risk management tool. Okay? It takes all the risks that your organization feeds up to it, determines which path it wants to take, and pushes down and communicates to the levels where necessary to make sure that they are managing the risks. And again, implicit statements are anywhere that a record is required is a risk management tool. Now, let's take a look at ISO and risk management. For manufacturers, most manufacturers use ISO 9001-2015 as their guide. The context of the organization, like I said earlier, is who are they serving, why are they serving, and what things are keeping my processes in check to make sure that I am providing the things I need to. For those of you who are doing medical devices in 15189, where you're producing like a heart catheter or a stent or something like that, those things are a threat to life and the welfare of people. So they'll use ISO 9001 and 15189 to help manage their risks. The leadership is extremely important in this as well, because they have to understand what the needs are of the customer. What is the customer focus? And they have to communicate that customer focus all the way down. We saw that in all of the Qualtrax. When you sat in all of the sessions yesterday, they do a fantastic job of driving down what the important parts of it, and they have an extremely great way of soliciting information from you to make sure that they're providing the best that they can do. This is one of the, and I'm saying this from a lot of organizations that I've been to, assessing, auditing, and consulting. It's one of the best that I've seen. So kudos to you guys for a job well done. Leadership is extremely key, and we heard that from Jeff yesterday. Planning is also very important. Making sure that planning for risk management is not a back-end process, okay? And you'll see in this next illustration up here, this is a plan, do, check, act diagram for those who are familiar with 9001. But if you were to sit in on Tim's session, Tim and CJ's session, you'll see that there's a parallel process called IAET, which is what I talked about earlier. You know, identify, analyze, evaluate, and treat. okay? And I always remember that as I always eat taters, right? Because I'm an engineer by birth. You know, we're talking about what you are by birth. That's me. So I need simple things to remind me how to remember things. But anyway, planning is extremely important. Risk management is not a back-end tool. And what I mean by that is it's not something that you do when everything else is done, okay? And then you're in corrective mode. And unfortunately, most people have looked at 17025, especially in the new standard, and even in the 2005 version, that corrective actions is when you manage and you fix things instead of being proactive. Okay. Proactive part of it is extremely important because if you're proactive, you minimize the back end work that you have to do on corrections, which actually is more costly to an organization. So I would encourage you to take a look at when you're in the planning phase, when you're taking on a new opportunity, you're looking at expanding a new workflow in the case that they're doing here, or you're looking at expanding your business or taking on rapid DNA testing, which is a new up and coming thing that I've been talking about in my office. You know, how does that work? If you plan for those risks, you can't anticipate all the risks, okay? All the people that are in, how many are in quality in here? Quality people are risk averse. They don't want to take any risks. They're the people that put those barriers up on the trampolines that, you know, that have ways like right there on the on-screen dashboard in their cars, you know. Where's the fun in that, you know? And it drives the people, when I was in my former organization, it used to drive them crazy. So Jeff was talking about personality assessments, so we'll take a quick detour here. I was trying to get them to move out. I was trying to get them to engage and create some new processes that were a little bit more efficient. And as a leader, I didn't want to be the initiator of that and come up with all the great ideas, because you know what management does. They just mess things up, right? So I said, hey guys, let's do this. And I had 7 people on my team around the country, and I said, let's do this. And they were like, nobody said anything. It was like crickets. And I was like, what do I do to get these people engaged? Obviously, I need to take more of Jeff's class, right? But, so I did a Myers-Briggs test of all of them, because I'm nerdy that way, right? So they're all like in this one tight little corner, and I'm way over here. I'm like, how do you draw these people in? So what I ended up doing is I created scenarios to get them to think. And then once, similar to what we're doing with when you're encouraging people to think about risks, is thinking them and drawing them out of their comfort zones, saying, what would happen to us if we did do this, and get them and help them to think a little bit further ahead than keeping comfortable, because quality people like comfort, right? So make sure that when you're doing your risk planning, you're doing it at the front end of the process. And then in 9001, make sure that you're doing your evaluations of the risks. The whole concept in 17025 and the new versions of all the conformity assessment standards is focusing on continuous improvement. It's not improvement based upon something bad happening, okay? That's corrective mode. How many of you like to work in damage control mode? Thank you, I'm glad. I hate damage control. Firefighting is my enemy, right? I had to do that on a submarine once. It's not fun, okay? So nobody likes to operate in that mode. Proactive mode is a lot more fun because you can be creative, okay? So for those people that are quality people, creativity, well, maybe a challenge. But anyway, and the bottom line is improvement. And when people start to see improvement, it is an engagement thing. People get more engaged when they actually are able to contribute to an organization. And when they're engaged, like Jeff said yesterday, guess what happens? The negative risk that we see starts to go away. And you start to see a lot more progression towards a better product because people are more engaged. Now, forensics. Forensics has got a lot more focus because of why? The risk to life and the safety of individuals. So you can see up here these 8 bullet points that we have. Impartiality and risk. Impartiality is significant. There are 3 sections in impartiality and risk in 17020 that speak specifically to managing risks and impartiality. Is that important? If they say it 3, you know your mom and dad said, right? If I tell you 3 times, right? It must be important, right? I've told you a million times. Administration, how does the management actually work with you to make sure you're managing these risks to impartiality? How is it structured? What processes do you have in place? Do you ensure that influences from other organizations, from the crime scene, and they come in and say, hey, we want you to do this when we talk about the 17025, and they say, hey, we want you to do this and you need to do it quickly, and you know you can't get it done because it takes too long to do this. We got to prepare it and all this other stuff that you have to do. How are you structured organizationally, and how is your management enforcing that to protect the inspections that you're doing? Personnel. Are your personnel aware of the risks? Are they aware of the influences from outside organizations? You know, a lot of people, when you're inspections, they want to take you out to lunch. They want to do all kinds of fun stuff for you to make it go a little bit nicer. Those things can't happen. Subcontracting. Flow down requirements, making sure that the subcontractors aren't adversely influenced by those outside people as well. I love that poll. I can't look at. I'm not going to dance, by the way. Complaints and appeals, making sure that when people do complain, there's a solid appeals process that are fair and equitable. Management systems, are they in place and robust enough to identify these flags? What objectives do they put in place to make sure that if there is a threat to impartiality, that it's quickly identified and managed so that there isn't that conflict? And then independence, there's a whole annex, 10, 12 pages of just talking about independence in the inspector's roles. Now, looking to 17025, which is more my comfort zone, this standard was written for all kinds of laboratories, both one-person laboratories up to multi-facility laboratories. And managing risk in those areas is different depending on every single organization. Okay? The reason I brought up the Ferrari and the speeding earlier is because everybody has different levels of risk in their organization. Management has one level of risk. Entrepreneurs have one level of risk versus the person that's in quality. Entrepreneurs tend to go out, let's challenge this boundary, let's try something new. And people in quality are like, no, 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 I want to hang on to my kingdom the way it is, right? So you need to work with, when you're, and I think Jeff said it yesterday, and I think Melissa did a good job with this too, is working with everybody of different levels of risk attitude to make sure when you're coming together for a solution, it's not all one directional. Everybody's coming together as a team to manage that risk. So again, we see up here impartiality and risk is discussed in 4.1 of the standard. And then conformity to risk is what we do when we're reporting. When you're making statements of conformity, like we said a little bit earlier, or I said a little bit earlier. The non-conforming work is really, in all of 17025, Section 4.1 and Section 710 and 8.5, and we'll talk about that here shortly, are the only ones that really talk about risk. And 710 is the only place that really talks about establishing risk levels. Okay, and when you take Tim and CJ's class this afternoon, if you didn't take it yesterday, they'll talk about these different types of risk levels. And guess what? You get to define what those risk levels are in your organization. Don't let the assessor tell you what they are. They have no idea what your culture is. They get a snapshot of it. Even your internal auditors have to study your organization in the areas that they're looking at to understand what that risk appetite is for that particular area that they're auditing. Okay? Because quality people tend to be risk averse, but if you go talk to management, it's a different picture. Everything is rosy and things like this, but quality people, oh, the sky is falling, right? I know, I was one of them, right? So making sure that you establish risk levels and they're effectively communicated. Section 5 talks about effective communication from management to the people that are actually doing the work, and communication all the way back up. The actions to address risks and opportunities is in Section 8.5, and this is what's really caused a ripple in the industry because they're like, I don't know what to do with this. Guess what? You're already doing it. You just didn't know it. Okay? You're already identifying risks because you've set objectives. You have management reviews. Everybody has management reviews, right? How about internal audits? Proficiency testing. Internal quality control. Do you have feedback? None of this stuff is new. None of it. We just restructured the standard and we put this risk component in there. You've already been managing risk. Now just associate it. That's the key of this course. That's your takeaway. Okay? Corrective actions, making sure they're appropriate to this impact to your laboratory. How many of you know 5 whys? How many of you use the 5 whys for, all right? You know what? They got rid of root cause analysis in the standard. You know why? There's only one root cause. People, right? So we'll just get rid of the people. Right? That's a risk, right? You can do that. No, that's stupid, right? You can't get rid of the people were the ones that created the processes, they created the objectives, they created the parts, they created everything that's going on in your laboratories or your inspection bodies. You can't get rid of the people. And one of the things Jeff said was, well, he didn't say it explicitly, implicitly that I read into it is like, take it off the people and put it on the process. Okay, that's why cause analysis is now key. So there's not just one cause, a root cause. That's misleading. That's what 5 whys does for you. Okay, it's a good tool, but it's not the only tool. And then management review takes all of these things from all the different departments, brings them all up, looks at them globally and says, I see some systemic issues here. Either management needs to change or we need to change our processes. And they have the effective communication of that dialogue all the way down to make sure that they're actually addressing risks. All right, internal auditing and risk. ISO 19011 is a guide document. It's not a standard. It's a standard, but it's not a mandatory standard. And part of that, most of you were internal auditors, or auditors of some sort. There are risks in everything you do. When you're doing internal auditing, you're actually setting the stage and you're setting a path for how an organization runs. Because what you retrieve and what you report to management will drive the way management moves the organization. So your role is extremely important as internal auditors, and most people will like, yeah, I got to do this internal audit. You know, I've got to, in my former company and many companies I see, I got to do an audit and guess what? It's due at the end of April and oh, it's May 1st. Snap, right? I got to get it done, right? So, and they kind of do the curly shuffle on that thing, if you know what curly is, right? And they don't put forth the effort that they need to. You, the internal auditor, measures the pulse of the company, okay? And it's extremely critical. So how you set yourself up for success in doing that is extremely important. You have to understand what this audit program looks like. So setting your foundation is extremely important. The competency of the people that you have on your staff. If you're not excellent in that measurement area, if you're not a GCMS person, a gas chromatograph, spectrum analyzer, mass spec, excuse me, then you need to bring somebody in that's technically competent to make those measurements in the matrices that you're measuring. Otherwise, you're not going to know whether or not you're doing something well. You have to set the program, the audit criteria. What are your objectives for this audit? The first thing you need to do is understand what the company objectives are from the management's perspective. What are their objectives for this particular area? And make sure, bless you, and make sure that this is carried down to the lowest level possible and is implemented effectively. Okay? Brain freeze. Making sure that you understand the objectives of the particular entity that you're auditing, making sure that they're clear and they understand their own objectives, and you're auditing the gap between what management's requiring and what the lab is requiring of itself. Are they meeting that? And if you don't understand those objectives, how are you going to measure them? Because that's your job. You're creating an unfortunate level of risk in your organization by not setting yourself up for success and setting your companies up for success, okay? Make sure that you have the appropriate resources. Make sure your people are trained properly on how to do auditing. And auditing is not the evil assessor that was up there, right? There are a lot of people that go out there with an agenda, internal auditors included. Tim said, I got to go out and do this audit, so I'm going to hammer through this. That's not the way you want to do it. When you're an auditor, the first hat you are is a coach, okay? You're a coach. It's not the beat me stick. You're out there to encourage and to get people to give you answers that help management make an excellent decision on the course it needs to go. You need to prioritize your methods. You need to understand how much time do you have. Time is precious. When you take people off the bench, remember we were talking about corrective actions? I actually walked through this session with somebody and said, you know, how many people and how much time does it take to fix a corrective action? One person makes a mistake, okay, the process makes a mistake, right? Let's not put it on the people. And the process revealed a mistake, and it takes roughly 5 people to fix it, right? The person that receives the phone call from the customer, or whoever it might be, management, the person that has to do the investigation, the actions that have to be put in place, another internal audit that has to happen as a consequence. And if you march down that, you can see one process flaw can drive a whole chain of reaction of things that happen. So when you're doing your audits, make sure you prioritize the type of audit that you're going to employ. Are you going to do a vertical audit in this case? Are you looking for systemic issues? So am I going to do a horizontal audit? Am I going to change my sampling techniques? Am I going to go for a go, no-go type sampling technique? Or am I going to do statistics and evaluate number of samples that I'm looking at to determine whether or not we're successful in that? And as a senior auditor, it is your job to make sure that you set that up based upon the risk that you're doing, that you're exposing yourself to. If it's a new measurement, a new opportunity, I like to spend a lot more time doing repeatability measurements. I will go from technician to technician to technician, and I'll ask them to demonstrate or at least discuss the processes with me. If it's a SAGE process that you've had in place for 25 years and your proficiency testing is revealing good results, then I do a vertical audit and call it a day, okay? So you have to be very strategic and manage your own risks for getting in there and getting out, okay? And guess what? The people that you're auditing know a lot about what you're asking. So if you spend a lot of time doing a horizontal audit when you should be doing a vertical audit, you frustrate your people and you get disengagement. They have work to do, and you have work to do, so you have to work together to make sure that that actually works out well. All right, 19,011-2018. These are areas that you need to take a look at with respect to auditing your program. Making sure that you have clear audit objectives and they're effectively communicated. You're going to be in this laboratory for X amount of time. I'm going to interview 3 people. We're going to look at 4 processes, and I'm going to need these records. Have them presented to me, and I will be out of your hair, if you have hair, in no time. Okay, we'll make this as efficient as possible. It's going to be a win-win for both of us. You have to set the stage for that. Team selection is extremely important. If you have people that are not competent on your team and are hemming and hawing or are driving home an agenda, you are not going to be successful. Okay, we were talking about Jeff, going back to the Jeff class yesterday, making sure that the people that you have on your team are engaged, and teach them how to audit. Okay, teach them how to inquire and ask good questions. All right, that's extremely important. That's probably the best piece of advice for internal auditing I could suggest to you folks. Making sure you have effective communication, which is the key. Reading body language is an extremely important tool and attribute you need to have in your quiver as an auditor. Just like training, just like getting up in front of an audience, you have to read your audience all the time to determine whether or not they're engaged. Are they disengaged? Am I being antagonistic? How do I come in and be their friend? Okay? Security and confidentiality. You need to make sure that when you're writing your notes, okay, one of the things I don't like doing is writing notes during my internal audits. I want to make sure that I'm engaged with them. I'm listening to them. I'm looking at their eyes and I'm getting information from them. And they need to know that when I do write my notes, that I'm not going to be writing back, Tim forgot to brush his teeth this morning, okay? Or some other thing like that. Remember, you're taking it off of the person, putting it back on the process. Making sure that if they give you information, that it's held in confidence. They need to know that they confide in you. And many times as an internal auditor or an assessor, you'll discover that people, when you ask the right question, all of a sudden Pandora's box opens up and all of a sudden the whole life story comes out about the whole organization. Anybody ever experienced that? Yeah, okay. They need to know and they need to feel secure that when they reveal that information to you, that you're not going to go off and spout it off. They just need a pressure relief, is basically what you are. You're not a counselor, because that takes you off your task, but you can be a listener for a time and manage your time appropriately. Making sure that you've got a durable audit program that's sound so you don't put your company at risk. Making sure that the auditee, this is another one, that the auditee is available and they cooperate. This is where a little psychology comes into play in managing that. The context of the auditee, what are their roles in the organization? Do they understand what it is that they have to do and why they're doing it? If they don't understand why they're doing it, I like to say they're making donuts. You ever see that commercial from Dunkin' Donuts? Got to make the donuts, right? Nobody loves an employee more than that, right? Got to get up and do the donuts. How do they make sure that they're engaged and understand? And sometimes when they're doing those repetitive measurements, it's very difficult to see. And Jeff brought this up yesterday, was you have to remind them sometimes of the importance of their job. Yeah, you're working a mass spec, or yeah, you're working a GC, or you're calibrating a torque wrench. But that torque wrench may be the very torque wrench that is used to tighten down the bolts on your car so that when you're driving down the road, your tire isn't passing you as you stop. Okay? That's an important safety thing. And just keeping those kinds of things in perspective is extremely important. And as an auditor and assessor, sometimes that might be your job, is to remind them how important their job is, because they might not be getting fed by management the other way. Changes in operations and is extremely important. When you're going in and setting up the audit, you need to understand, were there any personnel changes? Were there process changes? Maybe even management changes. And management changeover is probably the most significant ripple effect that you're going to find, especially when the one that left, I think we're talking about the bus, or I don't remember what the expression was. There was a sudden departure for some reason or another, and somebody else was promoted up in there, and everybody's going, I don't know which way we're going to go, okay? Because those objectives haven't been clear. The goals and objectives from that new management hasn't come across clearly yet. Changes in risks and opportunities. Part of continuous improvement is making sure that as you correct, as you improve, you go back and you revisit your risk profiles. And when you think, I want you to think about that this afternoon when you sit with Tim and CJ in their class, is when you do a risk and you've mitigated that risk, is that a significant risk anymore? If you've mitigated it to a point where it's not existent, then you can take that off your profile and then worry about some other, or focus on some other areas. And then audit methods and sampling methods, which I've already talked about. All right, internal auditing risks. So let's take a look at this. Let's do a side-by-side comparison in how the different standards manage risk with respect to the audit structure. In each of these, you see what you can see up here in 17020, you have to do 12-month intervals on your assessment. They're managing your risk for you because of the profile or the exposure that you have in the results that you're doing. In the other two standards, in 9001 and 17025, you get to determine the interval by which you do it and the frequency. And they can vary depending upon the different parts of the organization. You don't have to cover everything in the course of the year. But if you look at 15189, you will see, because it's medical devices, that they say a year as well. But most of the other 1702, other conformity assessment standards are pretty liberal in the way they approach that. Now, when you look at all of these standards, that Plan, Do, Check, Act thing is rolled into everything and every concept in these standards. So when you're doing an audit, making sure, like I said in this previous slide up here, all of these things are built into your audit program. This is part of the planning and the executing. And the one thing that most people don't do is they don't evaluate their audit programs. They don't self-evaluate or critique. How do you get better in your audits and provide more value add to the people you're auditing if you don't critique yourself? Do you solicit feedback? That is extremely important for you in understanding that. And your management has to give you some feedback on that as well. Because yeah, is your management set up that get the audit done, or that get the audit done and tell us how we did so we can make it better? Okay? As an auditor, an assessor, you need to understand what the makeup of the risks are and the personality and cultures are of the management that is driving it. Okay, Risks and workflows. We're almost finished here. Risks and workflows. The standards don't require procedures for risk management. They don't require policies. They don't require processes. They don't require a plan. Okay? I see when I teach the class and when I consult people, they're like, oh, we got to have all this built into this so we can address it. No. No, you don't. Because you've already been addressing it. Now, there are a lot of really cool tools out there, and when I was looking at the workflow, that workflow is really good, and I've seen some really good efficiencies that Qualtrax has done with that, and some really good tools that they're looking to build into it. But it doesn't require you to have a formal tool to do that. All the things that, like I said earlier, that you had in your standard, you had proficiency testing, evaluating the competency of your people. How do you do that? Performance evaluations. How do you manage impartiality? Conflict of interest statements that you have through your HR department. Okay? These are the things that as you're going through and you're doing audits and assessments, you're encouraged to share with them that you've already been doing it and how they've been doing it. Now, what does the standard require? It says that you do establish levels. If you go to 17025 and 7103, that when you, it requires you to have a procedure for non-conforming work, but in that procedure, you have to make sure that when you deploy the actions, that they're appropriate to the risk levels that are established by the company. Now, when it says established, does that mean you have to have a record saying that, okay, this particular risk is a high-level risk and this is a critical risk or this is a low risk? No. But what it does tell you that you do is that you communicate what those risk levels are. And that critical conversation should happen with the people at all levels of management review, from the supervisor level all the way up to the executive team. It does require that you do the PDCA approach to this, to risk analysis. You identify it, you identify the risks, and this gets back to those questions that we had at the beginning of the slides. Can they identify it? Do they know a risk when they see it? Okay? How do you analyze it? How do you evaluate it? And how do you treat it? And treatment is extremely important, okay? Because in the treatment phase, that's where you mitigate, okay? You have mitigation plans. You might choose not to, and Tim and CJ talked about it yesterday. You may choose to, you know what, I'm going to sit that off to the side for a little bit and I'm going to monitor it to see if this is a repeat issue. This might be a one-off issue that we're concerned with. And then in which case you have contingency plans or backup plans that you would put in place. And then in the treatment phase, that's when you adjust risk levels appropriately, okay? And you may choose not to adjust them. You may, if you've mitigated it well, you may reduce the risk levels and move on to other areas that you want to focus your attention on. Now, this is the spoiler for those of you that didn't attend Tim and CJ's class yesterday. This is an example of the workflow that they have built in. And so when you attend the class and you go through it, you can actually download that workflow and employ it in your systems already. But when you're doing risk management is just not a single level process. And what I've been trying to illustrate is it's a multi-level process, going from the bottom up and the top down. So when you're looking at risk flows, make sure that if any risk you identify, okay, if you look at the flow chart, you've got a risk is identified, you try to figure out, is this an improvement issue or is this a correction issue? And I didn't talk about opportunities here. This isn't part of the opportunities class, but opportunities is what positive risks and negative risks do I gain by taking on something, a growth area for me, okay? Determining what the correction, or if it's an improvement, you do the risk analysis, the evaluation, the treatment, and then when you do that, that's a cue for you to put something in the internal audit. Because when you do an improvement, you want to measure it, right? Or you do a correction, you want to measure it. I'm doing improvement in the positive sense, okay? Because there's a different section for improvement versus correction. And then when I measure it, how successful are we? Did we undershoot? Did we underestimate what these risks were, negative risks, and we need to beef them up? Or did I overestimate it and I spent too much money on it? I could have spent $500,000 instead of $2 million to mitigate a risk. I go back through and evaluate that, and then I adjust my risks accordingly based upon what we have. And did we mitigate it, or do we leave it alone? So, in conclusion, okay, the standards have been a sheep in wolf's clothing, okay? Risk, that's all it is, basically. We've already been talking about risk, and my goal here is to take some of the sting or the fear out of risk for you folks, okay? It's really not that big of a deal, all right? A lot of companies will spend a lot of money trying to manage this, and my goal to you is you've already been doing it. Don't go in overboard and using all these different fancy tools that you don't need to do. The workflow is a fantastic tool, and I would encourage you to do it, but there are all kinds of other tools that you can use: failure modes and effects analysis, fault tree analysis. There are dozens of tools out there that help you manage risks, but don't go overboard, right? Don't super engineer and Rube Goldberg a machine that's already been working, all right? So my last to you is kind of reflecting on some of what Melissa said yesterday and what Jeff said yesterday. And you know, I like to read, and this morning, and when I was reading something from Proverbs, and it said, "A joyful heart is good medicine, but a crushed heart dries up the bones." And a lot of people look at risk as a negative thing. And it's not. It's positive and negative. And for those of you that are in quality, my encouragement to you is that risk is a good thing, and it's a favorable thing. And the other four-letter word that most people tie in with risk is fear. And you shouldn't be afraid of it, okay? Courage is where you need to put your money in, right? That's the 7-letter word, right? Courage is what you need. You've got all the tools you need to manage your risk processes, right? There's nothing new that I told you today that you didn't know. I'm sure of it. Just wrapping it in a different package. Okay? All right. That's all I have for my presentation. Thank you very much.